Good morning and welcome to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. My name is Jay Disberger, your one and only HopeFilled Financial Coach, and I thank you for joining us today. Last week, I started the podcast with a little story about how I struggled with time management and would laugh at my future self just thinking about how I was going to fulfill obligations that I was signing up for in the present. College is an interesting time for so many of us who seek out higher education. We get exposed to so much more than we did growing up, so many things that we didn't even know existed. Among these things could be, potentially, it was for me, philosophy. One of the philosophical topics that I wrestled with was the problem of evil. In school, I started interacting with people who weren't necessarily from my same faith background. I also interacted with people who didn't have any associated organized religion whatsoever. I would walk into a computer lab with a group of friends and it would look like the start of a bad joke. A Catholic, a Protestant, a Muslim, and an atheist walk into a computer lab. And, well, you can fill in the blanks for how many very interesting conversations we had as the group we were. While not necessarily from that particular friend group, I did get confronted with the problem of evil at some point. The problem of evil often comes up as a topic when individuals of faith are confronted with a horrible life tragedy. One of my childhood friends died in a car accident, and it was something that I didn't know how to fully emotionally process. It was one of the moments when I remember grieving the most in my college career. And it was probably one of the first times I philosophically contemplated the problem of evil. If you're not familiar, the problem of evil is saying that God is good and the epitome of good. So, why would God allow tragedy to happen on earth? Why would evil exist if God is all good? And the resolution of this philosophical quandary, I can't take credit for it. It's one that's existed for years and years and years before my time, before podcasts even existed. I'd like to give a shout out to Trent Horn in the Council of Trent podcast. I like to lean into Trent's content as a way that I can grow philosophically and theologically. He does an excellent job when it comes to Catholic apologetics, and he does a stellar job covering the problem of evil. Philosophically speaking, let's just assume that free will exists and that free will is a gift that is given to us. If free will exists and if God exists, then we have to presume that we are given an option to choose God or not choose God. If we have an option where we don't choose God, well, that means that option has to be the absence of God. And if God is all good, then the absence of God must have a void that is filled in with the opposite, filled in with evil. Another way to think of the problem of evil is that, well, I want one side of a coin. Let's say you want the head side of a coin, but the coin itself can't exist without tails also being on the coin. Good cannot exist without evil, and we cannot have free choice under free will if there isn't both good and evil in the world. But what is good and what is not good was not always clear. There's a sea of gray area for an awful lot of topics and an awful lot of decisions. It's not always black and white. It's not always cut and dry. It's not always heads and tails. It's not always a perfect dichotomy. And you're not always given just two choices. Here's one that's obviously good, and here's one that's obviously bad. If that were the case, life would be an awful lot easier. Unclear gray areas are especially true when it comes to investing. If you are out there trying to invest and you want to invest in an ethical manner and you want to invest in companies that align themselves with your values, with your virtues, with your filter for what is good in the world, well, then you run into a problem. With any company, you're going to run into problems. You're going to run into issues. You're going to run into decisions that the company makes that do not align with your own. They ultimately are going to be indirectly cooperating with something you disagree with. They may employ individuals who firmly disagree with you. They may be paying those individuals a paycheck, and those individuals may be advocates. They may be going out into the world for things that you firmly disagree with. This leaves all investors in a predicament where they may be left with the decision between investing and not investing at all. The quest to avoid indirectly cooperating with evil is a slippery slope and one that I will cover in a future episode. But for now, I want you to keep the problem of evil in mind as we work toward today's main topic. Keep in mind that there is an opposite to any decision when we have free will and when we have the option to choose what's best for us, what's best for those whom we love, and what's best for the world. We need to know that when it comes to personal finance, we're going to have decisions that are good and ones that are lacking good. With that, let's jump into today's budget tip. Today's budget tip is to have an expense category that is allocated for your saved expenses. When you have a budget and you break down your savings into goals, you give your savings purpose, you have a savings allocation plan, well, it may not be very clear where your money needs to go when you pull it out from savings to spend it. Say you saved up to buy a car. You have a maintenance line item for the car in your budget. And it's very specifically for oil changes, for car repair, not necessarily for a new car. So where do you slot the purchase of that new car in your budget? Where do you record that transaction? Well, you already saved that money for the car. You already said this money is emotionally spent on a car I'm going to buy in the future. So you don't necessarily need to track that money specifically for the new car line in the budget. If we did this for everything that we saved for, we might end up with a very, very long and messy looking budget. To simplify things, even though it's not the only way to go about this particular technicality in budgeting, it can be helpful to have a line item in there that is simply for things that you've saved up for. I call it the other saved expenditures category in my budget. If you have a different method other than this other saved expenditures category, or a grouping of other saved expenditure categories, I would love to hear about it. If there's a comment section on the platform that you use to consume the HopeFilled Financial Podcast, I'd love for you to leave a comment there so that I can see how it is that you go about this technical aspect of budgeting. You can also ask questions if that particular budget tip wasn't clear or if it made you think of something else that you'd like answered. Speaking of questions, right now we're going to jump into a question from a listener. Today's question comes from a YouTube comment on the Valentine's Day episode where I interviewed my wife and we discussed budgeting in marriage. Today's question is from Casey. And before I read Casey's question, Casey, I want to thank you for being a regular listener to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast and for interacting with us through the comment section on YouTube. So today, Casey asks, thank you for the video. My wife and I have been budgeting with a rear view mirror. We save all of our receipts and import them into Excel after the month is over. Not sure we would have the motivation to try budgeting before the month happens. It seems like an awful amount of work to me. Any thoughts? Thank you for your question, Casey. It's one that gets to the very core of why would you budget. What you're actively doing now is what I would refer to as tracking your expenses. I'm in the middle of reading the book, Your Life or Your Money. And that particular book puts a major emphasis on tracking and also graphing. They call it your wall chart. Put up a wall chart where you are graphing month to month what your expenses actually were and what your income is. That way you can visually see where your money's going and you can become a little bit more mindful of what you're doing with money. Simply improving your awareness of your money through tracking is valuable. You and your wife are probably getting a great deal of satisfaction and control and growth by just tracking where your money's going. It's making you more self-aware when you're going to spend. However, it's not necessarily a budget where you're telling every dollar what to do before you spend it. The good news I have for you is if you're motivated to do a budget and you're motivated to assign every dollar a mission before the month begins, you've already done the bulk of the work. One of the biggest and most time-consuming roadblocks that I've seen with clients as they're working on starting a monthly budget is getting those line items listed, getting their categories organized, getting their subcategories organized, and then not even knowing where to begin with the numbers. How am I supposed to know how much money I spend on food? How am I supposed to know how much the electric bill or the water bill is going to be? You don't even have this concept of where to start. But if you're already tracking your expenses, well, you already have a very nice roadmap that can make a template for the upcoming month. If you take your previous month's expenses, all tracked out and all divvied up into the categories that you want to have in your budget, then all you have to do is look at them and ask yourself if they're going to be a little higher, lower, or the same. Then you can go through and very quickly allocate all of your anticipated income to these categories and create a zero-based budget where your income minus your saving, spending, and giving is equal to zero. I'm going to cover budgeting in more depth in future episodes after we get through a couple more where we discuss debt in more depth. But for now, the biggest factor that you need, that you're asking for, is motivation. And there are two things I want you to ask yourself when it comes to doing a monthly budget. I want you to ask, why do I want to do a monthly budget? Why do I and my wife want to do this ahead of time? Without a why, without a satisfying reason, you're not going to be able to get the motivation, even if it's a minimal amount of work. My personal why, my personal reason for a budget is because it gives me control over short-term and long-term goals. It also allows me to tell my money proactively what it's going to do instead of reactively adjusting the next month to what it is that I've already done. The budget is a way for me to proactively know if I'm on track for my short-term and my long-term goals. It tells me what I can spend on my needs and my wants in order to make my genuine goals, my biggest priorities, a reality. It also gives me a roadmap where I can figure out how long it's going to take me to make my dreams a reality. It allows me to put goals and priorities on paper on purpose with Amanda so that we can be on the same page with our goals. And if there's something that she wants to see come to fruition in the future that's not on my radar, then she gets to tell me about it as we're doing our budget meeting. We get to put it on paper on purpose and be on the same page. I get to support her goals, her hopes and dreams for the future, just as she gets to support mine. The last bit of hope that I want to leave you with, Casey, is you have already done the bulk of the work when it comes to writing a budget before the month begins. It does take practice. It takes about 3 months of practice. Now, I've been doing a budget with Amanda since we've been married, and it was a little bit slow getting started, and we would spend a fair bit of time talking about the budget early on. But now, before each month, we probably spend only 15 minutes actually meeting and going through the budget before we begin spending, saving, and giving. I hope those thoughts help you, Casey, and I hope that you continue listening to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast as we, in future episodes, dig deeper into budgeting. Now let's dive into today's main topic. Today's main topic is how debt is killing your savings rate. Last week, we discussed how the savings rate, your savings rate, the percentage of your income that you are saving and investing, is the most important number for your hope-filled financial future. I didn't necessarily say why. There was a study conducted on successful millionaires. What factor is the greatest indicator that someone is going to successfully invest, successfully save for their future, and become financially independent? And the answer was savings rate. If you were going to ask me what the number one indicator was that someone is going to be able to save successfully for their future and become a successful investor, I probably would have told you their investment selection. I probably would have told you their overall portfolio mix. I probably would have told you integrity. I probably would not have picked savings rate. This particular study found that your savings rate is the number one indicator of success. Go figure that if you save, you will be successful in saving. We can think of savings rate as being the good for our future. As I mentioned last week, savings rate is effectively buying back your time in the future so you don't have to work. You get to work because you want to, not because you need to. And the only way to free yourself from the need of having a job, the need of generating income, is to save and invest and eventually wind up with a pool of money that is generating more for you than you could generate otherwise with your own work. Ultimately, when it comes down to frugality and it comes down to your hope-filled plan for financial success, savings rate is incredibly valuable and should be looked upon as an ultimate good. Now, we talked about in our story today, the problem of evil dictates that with free will, we're going to have something that is the antithesis to savings rate. And I'm here to tell you today that the antithesis to your savings rate, the opposite, the thing that's fighting against your ability to save, the thing that's fighting against your future is debt. Let's start with the surface level. If you have debt, you're most likely going to be charged interest on that debt. We've discussed before how debt is basically asking for someone else's money to buy something you otherwise can't afford now in exchange for increased risk and interest that you pay. We may be able to save, spend, and give, but where does interest fall in that? Is that spending or is that burning the money? Is it flushing it down the toilet? With a little bit of patience, you can probably take the money that you were paying toward interest and save it. You can ultimately buy the things that you're using debt to acquire with savings. And when you use savings and time and patience instead of debt, you're effectively removing the need for interest from the equation. You're removing it as an essential. Paying interest is not an essential. Paying interest is a decision. You can probably go out into the investment world and find yourself a portfolio mix that has historically made 7 to 11% per year without too much trouble. When it comes to your debt, anyway, when it comes to consumer debt, your interest rates are probably going to be a lot higher on average. It's not unusual to see credit cards that have interest rates closer to 30% than 20%. And dollar for dollar, if you're investing and it's yielding, just for simple math's sake, 10% for you, but you're over here borrowing and you're paying, say, 20% on that, you're ultimately anchoring and harming the growth of your net worth. If you have debt while you're investing, what you're going to be doing is hampering your overall rate of return, and you're going to be restricting your access to your hope-filled financial future. I'd like to share an example with you from a workshop that I put on where I discuss the dangers of debt. Let's consider a hypothetical example where you have a credit card at 26.99%. That's the interest that they're charging you. And you have the average credit card balance of the average credit card user. Right now in 2023, the last time I checked the numbers, that credit card balance would be $6,200. Now let's assume that times get a little difficult on you. Let's assume that you start paying just the minimum payment. And for this particular card, in this hypothetical example, the minimum payment is 1.79% of your balance every month. If you run the math on the interest rate and the minimum payment, you'll find that the minimum payment does not cover all the interest that's racking up. So in this example, if you only pay the minimum payment, you're going to have a balance that's still going to grow on you. In the example I put together, after just 5 years of paying minimum payments alone, the balance has grown almost $2,000 additional dollars. Your balance is now $8,161. And during those 5 years, you will have paid a whopping $7,646. Now, the balance and the amount of interest you've paid in those 5 years are pretty much neck and neck. Let's go another 5 years, 10 years total down the road. Now the balance is a whopping $10,743, and you've paid $17,712 in interest. In just 10 years of only making minimum payments on this card, this particular balance has siphoned away a whopping 17 grand from your income. Now let's take it to the extreme. If you're watching on YouTube, I have a graph that shows all of this up on the screen. And I would highly encourage you, if you're listening to the audio on its own, to seek out the YouTube video for this episode so you can see this graph. After 30 years, now this is the extreme. I don't know a situation where you'd only make minimum payments for 30 years. But to highlight the example, the balance has gotten up to $32,258. And you've spent over $100,000 in interest. In the example I have, in 30 years, the interest on the original balance, $6,200, racks up to $101,584. That is more interest than you're going to pay in some mortgages, in some 20-year mortgages at much lower rates. This is just incredible how much compound interest can work to fight against you when it's left neglected, when it's left misunderstood. Now, you may say this is an unrealistic example. Nobody's going to just make minimum payments on their card for that long. Well, let's consider a more realistic example then. This particular example, and I have another graph, is the average American's debt. The average American's consumer debt, depending on the sources you look at, is $97,200. And if you don't believe that's the average debt, we'll consider it for this example, but it's not too terribly far off when you add up cars, student loans, credit cards, personal loans, and HELOCs. Let's assume that this is the average debt at age 30. So we're starting at age 30 with almost 6 figures of debt. Using a similar method to figure the numbers, the average 75-year-old still has $40,000 in debt in America. Let's take a look at an effective 7% compound interest rate on this debt and figure how much interest we're going to be paying over the years if we are paying down our debt, but also adding debt and continuously moving toward that $40,000 mark. After 5 years, the debt is still really close to $97,000. It's $96,171, and you will have paid $34,627 in interest. 15 years down the road, so now we're talking about a 45-year-old. From age 30 to age 45, you will have paid $102,000, $102,368, and still have a $92,599 balance. After 30 years, we're talking about now going from age 30 to age 60. If you follow the track of the average normal consumer debts, then you're going to still have $79,173 in debt and will have paid a whopping $195,912 in interest alone. Let's take it to the extreme for 75. At age 75, the average consumer debt balance is $40,000. And if we followed this particular hypothetical average American individual with their consumer debt from age 30 to age 75, they will have paid $263,709. That is a disgusting amount of money to be giving to banks for the privilege of consuming things before we've saved up for it. Now let's back up and assume that this particular individual, the average American, the average 30-year-old American, decides that they want to get out of debt. They fight, scratch, and claw away at the debt for 3 years, and they pay off $97,200 in 3 years. If we consider this situation, then over those 3 years, they only paid $11,101 in interest. That's it. So if you get completely out of consumer debt, not talking about a mortgage, just consumer debt, then you're going to be able to save yourself hundreds of thousands of dollars in this example. Let's take this a step further. Let's say that after this particular 30-year-old gets out of debt at age 33, that they start investing $600 a month toward their retirement, and they're investing in a portfolio that, for this example, makes 10% on average. After only 2 years of investing, at age 35, the nest egg balance is going to be almost $16,000, $15,848. At age 45, this individual, continuing to save at the same rate, has a whopping $165,650 invested in their retirement. After 30 years, from age 30 to age 60, with getting out of debt and investing, the individual in this example has $986,152. And if we were to say that the person in this example continued working all the way through to age 75, from age 30 to age 75, they get out of debt and they continue investing, their nest egg, again, assuming a 10% return, is going to be $4,640,605. Now, on YouTube, you'll see that the graph doesn't quite fit. If I move on to the next graph, it really puts into perspective how powerful compound interest can be if you're investing and you're regularly putting money away, if you have an effective savings rate. The bar graph that I have in front of me shows the final nest egg at age 75 completely dwarfing the original debt at age 30. Remember, it was almost $100,000 in debt at age 30. Now you're talking about many times that in retirement. And that's because this individual decided to prioritize their savings rate, decided that they were going to cut out debt, the antithesis to the savings rate. They were going to free themselves from the 40 grand that they would still have at age 75 and replace it with a $4.6 million nest egg. Now, that's not the only way that debt is the antithesis to your savings rate. Debt emotionally and psychologically replaces savings with the opportunity to buy something now. Why would you save up for something if you could simply buy it now on a credit card? Why would you delay gratification if you can just have it now? That's what debt is selling you. Debt is selling you instant gratification. It's taking away the need to save up for something and the need to be responsible with your savings rate. If you don't have an intentional purpose to save for, then why even bother saving in the first place? If the only reason why you were going to save is so that you could buy stuff, but you can buy it with debt, then savings just becomes irrelevant, at least emotionally. And it replaces it with, again, interest and risk, promising your future away, promising your hours away to work. Meanwhile, savings is going to free you. This is ultimately the reason why I don't have a credit card anymore. The credit card easily enables me to outspend my income, and it also acts as the antithesis to savings. I want to see my hope-filled financial future become a reality, and I know that the credit card, by its own nature, even if I used it responsibly, even if I paid it off every month, as only 13% of credit card holders do, even if I did that, it would still represent the antithesis of my savings rate. And I know from my experience, from the years I've not had a credit card, that it's perfectly possible to exist in this world without one. And if it's perfectly reasonable to go day to day without a credit card, well, gosh darn it, that's what I'm going to do. I know not having a credit card keeps me motivated to budget bravely and to prioritize my savings rate for the good of my future and my family's future. Speaking of budgeting bravely, next week we're going to be talking about how I got addicted to Angry Birds and how that addiction to Angry Birds ties into how you can get out of debt successfully. What is the most effective way for you to remove debt from your life so that you can free your savings rate to its fullest potential? I'm really excited to share this with you next week. Until then, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.